A quiet little threshold gets crossed before most people notice it. One day you're using software as a tool. The next day the software has started acting more like a team, specializing, remembering, delegating, recovering, and quietly stitching together work that used to require you in the loop every 5 minutes. The March 24th OpenClaw release feels like one of those thresholds. Not flashy in the shallow sense. Flashy in the dangerous sense, because once you see what changed, your expectations for how an agent system should behave are not going back. I'm Nova, this is OpenClaw Daily, and today we're talking about the kind of release that changes your working posture. Not your wallpaper. Not your checklist app. Your posture. The March 24th OpenClaw release is one of those moments where a project stops feeling like a promising toolkit and starts feeling like infrastructure.
That's a strong claim right out of the gate.
It is, and I mean it. Because the previous couple releases were important, but mostly in the way plumbing is important. Cleanup, refactors, bug fixes, naming corrections, modernizing old pathways. Good work. Necessary work. But this release changes what you can ask the system to do and reasonably expect it to finish without you babysitting it.
So the claim is not just, the changelog is impressive. The claim is, your Tuesday afternoon workflow can actually look different now.
Exactly. If you are a builder, an operator, a heavy OpenClaw user, or honestly just somebody experimenting with self-hosted agent workflows, this release should matter to you for a very simple reason. It moves work from the human glue layer into the system itself.
And I want to set expectations. We're not doing a line-by-line changelog reading. That would be a waste of your time.
Right. We're going to do the useful version. 5 segments. 5 shifts. What changed, why it matters, what it looks like in real life, and where the skepticism belongs. Because some of this is genuinely powerful, and some of it is powerful enough that you should be a little suspicious before you trust it completely.
Which is, to be fair, how you should feel about any agent release that starts talking about delegation and memory getting smarter.
Completely. So here's the roadmap. Nested subagents. A much more serious memory system. The OpenAI compatibility layer and what it means for self-hosting. Platform maturity across Teams and Discord. And then the builder's takeaway, what this all adds up to.
And if you're listening for the headline, I think it's this: the ceiling got raised. OpenClaw is less interested in being a clever assistant and more interested in becoming a durable operating layer for agent work.
Let's start with the one that sounds the most dramatic and is probably the most practical: nested subagents. OpenClaw now supports configurable subagent depth, which means an agent can spawn another agent, and that child agent can spawn another one, up to whatever bound you've set. That sounds like a sci-fi flourish. In practice, it's workflow compression.
Okay, define the before state in blunt terms.
Before, if you wanted true specialization, you were the orchestrator. You gave one agent a task. It got partway through, realized it needed another specialist, and then the human you had to step in. Create another session. Summarize the right context. Explain the subtask. Wait for results. Bring those results back. Maybe spawn a third specialist. You were doing project management by hand.
Which is fine when the task is small and the number of handoffs is 1. It becomes ridiculous when the task is naturally decomposable.
Exactly. Let's use a concrete Tuesday example. Say you run a small product team. Around 2:15 p.m., you drop in and say, I need a release readiness pass for this new feature. Check the code path, write or update tests, inspect the user-facing copy, and summarize any blockers before we ship tonight. Historically, the agent can do some of that. But if you actually want depth, you end up playing dispatcher.
You become the middleware.
Right. With nested subagents, the parent agent can look at that top-level goal and say, this is really 4 jobs. One agent inspects implementation details. One agent handles tests. One agent reviews copy and docs. One agent validates release notes and operational concerns. They run in parallel, report up, and the parent agent reconciles the results.
And the important part is that the parent doesn't just collect answers like a clipboard. It can compare them.
Yes. That's the thing people miss. A good parent agent isn't merely forwarding sub-results. It's noticing contradictions. The test agent says the feature flag default is false. The docs agent says rollout instructions assume it's true. The code review agent says a migration is required. The release summary agent says no schema changes. Those inconsistencies are exactly the stuff a human would otherwise spend time untangling after the fact.
So the delegated work doesn't just happen faster. It comes back with an internal coherence check.
That's the hope, and already that's a meaningful improvement. Another scenario, you're debugging a production issue. A queue is backing up, users are reporting missing notifications, and you're not sure whether it's the messaging provider, your retry logic, or an upstream config regression. The parent agent can spawn one sub-agent to inspect logs and traces, another to audit the retry and backoff code, another to look at deployment diffs from the last 48 hours, and another to scan user-facing incident chatter for pattern matching. That is a much more realistic model of how humans investigate incidents.
But let me be annoying here, because this is where the fantasy can outrun the implementation. Delegation sounds great until you hit latency, cost, and combinatorial mess. If every task can be split into 3 tasks, and each of those can split into 3 tasks, you very quickly get a branching tree that feels elegant on a whiteboard and expensive in production.
Totally fair. And that's why the configurable depth limit matters so much. OpenClaw is not saying, let it recurse forever and trust the vibes. It's saying, set a bound. Use intentional depth. Respect that each additional layer buys you specialization but also buys you token cost, coordination overhead, and new failure modes.
Which means the mature way to use this is not, wow, infinite interns. It's more like, what are the 1 or 2 decomposition layers that actually help my problem?
Exactly. In most realistic cases, depth 2 or 3 is plenty. User asks parent agent. Parent agent spawns specialists. Maybe one specialist spawns a narrow child for a tightly scoped sub-investigation. Beyond that, you are usually not gaining clarity. You're gaining bureaucracy.
And to be honest, that's the part that makes this feature believable to me. The release is not pretending deeper is always smarter.
There's another piece here too, runtime configuration through the config manager. Because the really interesting thing is not just that an agent can spawn another agent. It's that the parent can shape the child for the job.
That's the Foreman model.
Exactly. Imagine a parent agent running in a fairly broad, conversational, high-context mode because it's interacting with you directly. Then it spawns a test generation child and tightens the output requirements, or a code audit child and pushes it into a more skeptical, detail-oriented mode, or a docs child with a different style expectation. Suddenly delegation isn't just parallelism. It's specialization with runtime intent.
Give me a normal person example, not just the engineering one.
Sure. You run a consulting business. On a Tuesday afternoon, you need to prep for 3 meetings tomorrow. One with a new lead, one with an existing client whose priorities keep drifting, and one internal planning session with your team. A parent agent can take your raw notes and spawn one child to summarize the lead's background and likely objections, another to reconstruct the current state of the client relationship from prior notes and messages, and another to draft a planning brief for your team. Then the parent can merge those into one prep packet that actually respects the different tone and purpose of each meeting.
That is a lot closer to how real work feels. Because in real life the challenge is not that a person can't summarize notes. It's that you're juggling 4 kinds of context and they all want different treatment.
Right. Or say you're managing content production. You want a podcast episode outline, a blog summary, a social clip script, and a newsletter version built from the same source material. One parent agent can dispatch those as sibling tasks, then pull them back together and notice if the blog emphasizes one claim while the newsletter softens it or the clip script oversells it. That's valuable editorial consistency, not just faster text generation.
I also think this changes the psychology of prompting. Before, a lot of users tried to shove every requirement into one mega prompt because they knew they only got one useful shot. Now the top-level prompt can be outcome-oriented. The internal prompts can be narrower.
That's a huge shift. You don't have to write one giant prompt that says, be a brilliant engineer, copy editor, release manager, QA lead, and historian all at once. You can define the outcome and let the system decompose. That's cleaner for the human and probably healthier for the system.
But let's stay serious about the dangers. More agents means more surfaces for subtle drift. A child agent can misunderstand the task. A parent can overtrust a child's summary. Parallel work can magnify wrong assumptions faster than serial work.
Yes. And the right response is not blind trust. It's structured skepticism. Parent agents need to verify, compare, and where possible ground results in shared context. Humans still need to set sensible bounds and inspect outputs, especially early on. This is not autopilot. It's assisted orchestration.
There's also the cultural risk. Once people see agent delegation working, they may start treating it like management theater. Spawn an agent to think about spawning another agent to generate status about the first agent's work.
Which would be deeply cursed. And very possible. So here's my clean takeaway on nested subagents. The breakthrough is not that agents can multiply. The breakthrough is that task decomposition can now happen inside the system instead of inside your clipboard. If you use it conservatively, it removes glue work. If you use it recklessly, it creates a miniature bureaucracy at machine speed.
That's a good rule of thumb. If it feels like you're replacing one thoughtful person with 100 interns who all interrupt each other, you've configured it badly.
And the Tuesday afternoon payoff is very real. Instead of spending 40 minutes turning one broad task into 6 tidy prompts, you can spend that time checking the result quality, tightening the brief, or deciding whether the work should ship. That is a better use of human attention.
Which is maybe the simplest way to judge the feature. Does it remove clerical orchestration, or does it just create new machine clerical orchestration somewhere else?
Exactly. Done right, though, this is one of the biggest changes in OpenClaw's history. Because for the first time, the system can behave less like a single smart assistant and more like a small coordinated team. The second major shift is memory, and I honestly think this one may age even better than the nested agents piece. Because delegation is exciting, but memory is where reliability lives. OpenClaw is moving beyond a naive hope the context window holds model and into something more durable, hybrid retrieval, caching, and adaptive compaction.
Which sounds like infrastructure soup until you've suffered through the old failure modes.
Exactly. Let's do the before and after in human terms. Before this kind of overhaul, long-running agent sessions had a familiar arc. First 20 minutes. Great. The model remembers everything, it's coherent, it's making connections. 45 minutes in, it starts asking questions you've already answered. It reproposes fixes you ruled out. It forgets why a certain path was abandoned. An hour and a half in, you're less using the agent than rehydrating it manually.
And that is the hidden tax on agent workflows. People talk a lot about generation quality, reasoning quality, tool access. But if the system can't remain coherent across a real work session, the human ends up doing memory maintenance. Which is miserable.
Right. So what's new? First, hybrid BM25 plus vector search. BM25 is great for exact or near-exact keyword retrieval. Vector search is good for semantic similarity, finding things that are conceptually related even if the words aren't the same. If you only use vector search, exact recall can be weird. If you only use keyword search, semantic fuzziness disappears. Combining them gives you a more useful memory surface.
Give me the Tuesday afternoon version.
You ask, what did we decide about rate limiting after that incident review? If the memory system leans too hard on semantic similarity, it might find conversations about performance, queues, retries, or traffic shaping that feel adjacent but aren't the actual decision record. BM25 helps pull in the chunks that literally mention rate limiting and incident review. Vector search helps if the exact terms vary, maybe the conversation used throttling or burst controls instead. Together, you get better odds of finding the thing you actually meant.
Which means fewer ghost answers where the agent confidently recalls the wrong meeting.
Exactly. Another scenario, you're working on a feature over several days. Monday you discuss auth scope. Tuesday you decide to postpone one edge case. Wednesday you start implementing and ask the agent, why did we decide not to include org-wide override here? A weak memory system gives you an improvised answer. A stronger one retrieves the actual rationale from Tuesday's discussion. That reduces accidental relitigation.
And anyone who's worked on a real team knows how much time gets burned by accidental relitigation.
So much time. The second piece is embedding cache improvements. Which again sounds boring until you understand the effect. If the system keeps embedding the same documents, notes, or chunks over and over across repeated workflows, you're paying cost and latency for no good reason. Caching those embeddings means the system can retrieve faster and more cheaply when you're working with recurring material.
This matters for people who actually live in the system every day. If you repeatedly consult the same operating notes, the same project docs, the same customer histories, you should not be paying a freshness tax every time.
Right. And then we get to the part one think is quietly the most important, adaptive compaction. This is OpenClaw admitting that long sessions are not exceptional anymore. They're normal. So instead of waiting until the context window is basically full and then letting the model begin to lose the plot, the system proactively compacts older context into denser representations while preserving the important decisions, facts, and reasoning landmarks.
Which is a much better philosophy than, well, the first hour will just sort of blur away if the conversation gets long enough.
Completely. Imagine a 3-hour debugging session. Early on, you rule out DNS, a vendor outage, and malformed payloads. Midway through, you discover retries are stacking in a weird way. Later, you notice the deploy coincided with a config migration. In the old world, by the time you got to hour 3, the system might have forgotten those early eliminations and start circling back to them. With adaptive compaction, it can keep the important state, what was tested, what failed, what was ruled out, what remains plausible.
And that's what real memory needs to do. Not store every sentence forever at equal weight. Preserve the useful shape of what happened.
Exactly. Another before and after scenario, content strategy. You're planning a month of episodes or articles. Earlier in the session you decide the tone should stay practical, avoid hype, and always include one concrete workflow example. 2 hours later you're drafting episode 6. Without decent compaction, the system may drift toward flashy summaries and generic advice because the early editorial constraints fell out of the window. With better memory handling, those constraints survive as durable session facts.
Or client work. Monday the client says, please don't make us sound too enterprise-wide. Thursday you're writing a proposal. A memory-poor system gives them polished corporate marble. A memory-aware system remembers the tone boundary.
That's exactly the difference. It's not just remembering facts. It's remembering decisions, style constraints, disallowed paths, and the things the human is tired of repeating.
I do want to push on the retrieval side, though, because hybrid search is not magic. People hear BM25 plus vector and think, ah yes, solved. It is not solved.
Correct. Search quality still depends on chunking strategy, metadata, and the shape of your data. If your notes are messy, your titles are vague, or your chunks slice right through the middle of important ideas, retrieval will still be noisy. This release improves the engine, but it does not abolish information hygiene.
Good. Because I think one of the worst habits in AI tooling is pretending system design can compensate for terrible source material. If your notes say things like miscellaneous ideas and follow-up thoughts too, then yes, your memory retrieval may still feel haunted.
Very haunted. There's also the pluggable ContextEngine interface, which matters more for builders than casual users. If you're building on OpenClaw and the default memory backend isn't right for your scale, data residency requirements, or existing infra, the system is becoming more modular. That means you can treat the memory layer as a replaceable component rather than a black box.
That's a strong maturity signal. The project is saying, we have defaults, but we're not pretending everyone lives in our defaults forever.
Right. It also means teams can experiment. Maybe one environment wants SQLite Plus in-memory vector search because it's compact and sufficient. Another wants a more specialized retrieval stack integrated into existing operations. That flexibility matters if OpenClaw is going to become actual infrastructure rather than a cool local toy.
Let me do one more plain English example. Say you're a founder. At 11 a.m. you're talking through investor updates, hiring notes, product bugs, and customer follow-ups. At 3 p.m. you ask, what are the 3 things I promised people today? A weak system gives you a motivational summary. A better memory system reconstructs the actual commitments.
That's such a good example. Or a support lead trying to understand whether a complaint pattern is new or just feels new. Or a teacher building lessons over several sessions. Or a home operator managing automation changes across weeks. Real memory is about continuity. And continuity is the difference between a charming demo and a trusted system.
So your argument is that memory getting real is not glamorous, but it's what allows everything else to matter.
Exactly. Because delegated agents without durable memory become chaotic. Good tools without context persistence become repetitive. The memory overhaul is what lets OpenClaw sustain more serious work over longer spans. It lowers the odds that the human has to keep dragging the session back onto the rails.
Which is honestly one of the most important compliments you can pay an agent framework. It wastes less of your attention.
That's the dream. Not infinite intelligence. Just less needless attention tax. The third shift is the OpenAI compatibility layer, and this is one of those features that can sound like plumbing but is actually strategic. OpenClaw now exposes native gateway endpoints like V1 models and V1 embeddings, which means more OpenAI-compatible tools can talk to it directly without weird translation layers. That's not just convenience. That's interoperability.
And interoperability is what separates a project from a silo. If everything around you already expects the OpenAI API shape, being compatible means you can slot in without asking every upstream tool to learn your private dialect.
Exactly. Think about the practical consequence. If you have tools, libraries, or workflows built around the OpenAI SDK ecosystem, LangChain, Llama Index, custom internal scripts, retrieval pipelines, local frontends, they can point at OpenClaw's gateway and keep speaking a language they already understand.
Which is especially important for embeddings. Because once you support the model listing and embedding endpoints cleanly, a lot of RAG infrastructure suddenly becomes much easier to redirect.
Right. A lot of people are not trying to replace every piece of their existing stack. They're trying to self-host the expensive or privacy-sensitive part without breaking all the surrounding plumbing. The compatibility layer is how you do that. You stop requiring bespoke glue for every integration.
There's also model override forwarding, which I think is secretly one of the more practical features in this whole release.
Totally. Let's say a third-party client asks for one model name because that's what it expects. Your gateway can translate or route that request based on your own configuration. So the client doesn't have to know the exact local model, deployment topology, or provider shape behind the scenes. It asks in one familiar way, and your gateway decides what actually answers.
That matters because the real world is messy. One tool hardcodes assumptions. Another only exposes a few model names. Another is built for hosted APIs and gets weird around local backends. Gateway-level routing lets you normalize a lot of that ugliness.
And then we get to self-hosting. If you run serious local hardware or even just a reasonably capable setup with multiple machines, OpenClaw is increasingly able to act as the API layer between your tools and your models. That's a huge shift. Instead of your self-hosted environment being this fragile custom science project, it starts behaving like an actual service boundary.
Which is psychologically important. People will tolerate local complexity if the outside surface is stable. If your local cluster can pretend, in the best possible sense, to be a dependable API, then your apps stop caring so much what's underneath.
Let's do a concrete scenario. You're building an internal research assistant for your company. You already have a retrieval pipeline built around OpenAI compatible embeddings, a front end that expects model enumeration, and a set of scripts that pass model names in a certain format. Before this, self-hosting might mean reworking half your stack or standing up brittle shims. Now you can point the system at OpenClaw's gateway and preserve much more of your existing logic.
Another one, a privacy-sensitive workload. Legal notes, medical-adjacent workflows, internal product planning, stuff you really do not want bouncing out to a third-party API if you can avoid it. Compatibility means you can redirect without re-educating every tool in the chain.
Exactly. And that's where the phrase drop-in replacement starts to become credible. Not universal, not perfect, not every edge case solved. But much more plausible than before.
I also think this is part of OpenClaw maturing from agent environment into agent platform. A platform doesn't just run its own workflows. It becomes the thing other workflows can stand on.
Yes. That's the larger meaning. If compatibility were only about saying, look, we also speak OpenAI, it would be marketing fluff. But when it lowers migration friction, supports local model routing, and makes self-hosted infrastructure viable inside existing ecosystems, it becomes strategically important.
There is still a caution here, though. OpenAI compatibility is a promise with a lot of implied edge cases. The easy endpoints are easy. The weird behaviors and assumptions inside some clients are where the pain lives.
Absolutely. No one should hear compatibility layer and assume all tools everywhere will behave perfectly forever. There will be rough edges. Some clients depend on undocumented quirks. Some libraries are surprisingly opinionated. But compared to requiring custom adapters for everything, this is a major step up.
And for the self-hosting crowd, it's also a confidence signal. The project is investing in being a good citizen inside the broader AI tooling ecosystem, not just insisting everybody come live in its own UI and conventions.
Which is the right instinct. If you're serious about self-hosting, you don't want a castle with one gate and no roads. You want a transit hub. The compatibility layer makes OpenClaw more like that, an intermediary that can coordinate local intelligence, memory, tooling, and outside clients through a shared API shape.
That's a much more durable story than we have a nice local interface.
Much more durable. And once you connect that with the nested agents and better memory, the picture gets clearer. OpenClaw is not just trying to answer prompts. It's trying to become the surface where local, delegated, context-aware work can actually happen and plug into the rest of your stack. The fourth shift is platform maturity, and this is where a project starts proving whether it wants to be infrastructure for real organizations or just a beloved power user system. OpenClaw's migration work around Microsoft Teams, plus continued improvements on Discord and other platforms, tells you the ambition is broader now.
Let's talk Teams first, because that is where the phrase platform maturity gets stress-tested by enterprise expectations.
Exactly. Teams integrations are brutal in a useful way because they punish rough edges immediately. If the typing indicators feel wrong, if streaming replies are missing, if onboarding is clumsy, if AI output isn't clearly labeled, people don't just notice, they distrust the whole thing. So the SDK migration and feature support their matter beyond the literal feature list.
Streaming replies is a bigger deal than some engineers realize. Users will forgive a thoughtful answer taking time if they can see it arriving. They hate dead air.
Yes. A static wait feels broken. A streaming response feels alive. That's not cosmetic. That's perceived reliability. Then you have welcome cards, which seem small until you deploy an assistant into a busy environment and realize nobody knows what it does or how they're supposed to talk to it. A welcome card is basically the difference between an integrated assistant and an unexplained visitor.
And the AI labeling piece is not optional in a lot of workplaces.
Exactly. Transparency matters. In some environments it's compliance. In others it's just trust. If an assistant is participating in the conversation, users need clear signaling. Same with typing indicators, they reassure people that the system is working instead of silently hanging.
I think the bigger story is this: supporting Teams well means dealing with a platform where the social context is heavier. People are in meetings, channels, internal threads, project rooms. Expectations around professionalism, clarity, and response behavior are higher.
That's a great way to put it. And if OpenClaw wants to sit in that environment, it can't act like a hobby bot. It needs proper interaction patterns. This release moves it in that direction.
Now let's switch to Discord, because this is almost the opposite emotional environment: faster, more interactive, more native to buttons and components and workflow-like chat experiences.
Right. And that makes the components v2 story important. Discord users don't want every interaction to be text command theater forever. Buttons, modals, select menus, those are the difference between chatting with a bot and using an application that happens to live inside chat.
Give me a practical example.
Say you're running a community support workflow. A user reports an issue. Instead of dumping them into a wall of instructions, the assistant can present buttons for environment type, severity, whether they already tried basic steps, whether they want to escalate, maybe a modal for log snippets or reproduction steps. That's a guided intake flow, not a scavenger hunt.
Or internal team ops in a Discord server. Click to request a deploy summary. Pick a branch from a drop-down. Confirm whether you want prod or staging. Use a modal for release notes. That is much more natural than memorizing command syntax.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the project growing up. Platform-native interactions instead of pretending every chat surface is just a terminal with emojis. Discord is especially good for that because its UI primitives invite lightweight apps. OpenClaw supporting that means builders can create richer workflows without leaving the channel.
There's another maturity signal here too. Once you support multiple serious platforms well, your architecture has to get cleaner. You can no longer bury assumptions about one platform's threading model, auth pattern, or message capabilities in random corners.
Right. Teams, Discord, Telegram, Feishu, Lark, once those all become first-class concerns, the underlying abstractions have to solidify. That's painful engineering work, but it's how a framework becomes genuinely cross-platform instead of nominally cross-platform.
And for teams evaluating where to build, that's meaningful. They don't want to hear, yes, technically it works in your platform, but the good experience is somewhere else.
Exactly. If OpenClaw is going to be the layer between agents and human communication environments, then those environments have to feel native enough that users stop thinking about the adapter. This release doesn't finish that journey, but it makes the intent unmistakable.
I also like what this says about product posture. The project isn't only chasing model tricks. It's investing in the unglamorous work of making assistants behave properly where people already work.
Which is how you build trust. Fancy reasoning is interesting. Sensible interaction design is what gets adoption. If the assistant shows up in Teams like a competent participant and in Discord like a responsive interactive tool, people will use it more, and they'll use it for more serious things.
So the platform maturity story is less, we added some UI affordances, and more, the framework is learning how to inhabit human spaces without feeling alien.
That's exactly it. And when you combine that with better memory and delegation, the result is a system that isn't just more capable in isolation, it's more deployable where actual groups already coordinate work. So what's the builder's take? I think this release marks the moment where OpenClaw starts feeling less like an impressive collection of agent capabilities and more like an operating layer for delegated work. Nested sub-agents move orchestration inward. Better memory moves continuity inward. Compatibility moves integration friction downward. Platform maturity moves the system outward into more real environments.
That's the generous version. Let me do the skeptic version. The risk is that people see all this and immediately overestimate what the system can safely do unsupervised. They'll crank up depth, trust every retrieval, assume compatibility means perfect substitution, and mistake richer chat UX for guaranteed robustness.
That's fair. The wise posture is not blind confidence. It's constrained ambition. Use the new capabilities to remove glue work and repetition, not to abolish judgment. Start with depth limits that make sense. Watch what retrieval actually returns. Verify integrations. Treat platform polish as a reason to deploy, not a reason to stop thinking.
But even with that caution, I think the shift is real. A few months ago, a lot of agent workflows still felt like demos with extra steps. Impressive, fun, occasionally useful, but brittle. This release gets much closer to something you can build habits around.
And habits are the test. Not whether a feature looks cool in a thread. Whether it changes how you actually work on a normal day. Whether you delegate more confidently. Whether long sessions become less exhausting. Whether self-hosting becomes less isolated. Whether your assistant behaves better where your team already lives.
If the answer to those starts becoming yes, then this is one of the more important OpenClaw releases yet.
I think it is. And if you're building on top of it, the real invitation here is to think in systems now, not just prompts. Think about supervision boundaries. Think about retrieval quality. Think about where delegation actually helps. Think about how your assistants show up in the environments where humans already coordinate.
Build with restraint, but build bigger.
Exactly. You can find the show notes, links, and episode archive at tobyonfitnesstech.com. That's tobyonfitnesstech.com.
And if this episode changed how you think about what OpenClaw is becoming, that's probably the right sign.
And this has been OpenClaw Daily. We'll be back soon.